Hi, welcome everybody. So today we're talking about mental health and the criminal justice system. The first thing I'm going to do is summarize and draw some patterns across your first Canvas reading, the Hidday and Burns reading. Then we will talk a bit about voices. I'll have you do some discussion questions and I will have you find some quotes. And so you'll notice that at the very beginning of the semester, I would provide you guys with quotes and kind of ease you into it. Now at this point in the semester, I kind of have you on your own finding your quotes yourself. The reason that I have you doing this is because for your exam, you're going to be asked to find quotes. And so at this point in the semester, I want you to be able to do it yourself. And if you're struggling, of course, you can reach out to me and ask. After we go through the 9th floor and your voices book, I will give you an overview of what you need to know for assignment 5 of 5. So congratulations, you made it. You've done all of your assignments to this point. As of Sunday, you'll be totally done with that part of the class. And then after that, I will give you a quick overview of what your final presentation will be like. I listed it last week. I sent out an announcement about it. If you have any questions, of course, ask me, but it's pretty straightforward. You can pick the chapters that you choose to work with, and it's pretty open-ended. You'll see that I have the presentations being a max of like 10 to 15 minutes. If you start to get to the 20-minute mark, you have to cut it down. But so just think about it, if it's only 10 minutes, you're doing 2 chapters, you're talking, about 5 minutes per chapter, and the chapters are only like 10 pages. So it's not really an overwhelming amount of work, but you do have to do it. It's worth 12 points. Like I told you before, you can't pass this class or get an A in this class, I should say, without at least completing every major assignment. So that's what we have in store for today, but let's go ahead and jump into it. So overall, there are 2 prevailing beliefs about why we see the relationship between the mentally ill and the criminal justice system. One is the belief that deinstitutionalization, so remember, deinstitutionalization is movement away from the mental hospital, shifting movement away from the mental hospital to community resources and community care. And so one belief about why we see so much mental illness in the criminal justice system is that deinstitutionalization, that move away from the mental hospital, has led to the criminalization of the mentally ill. So that's the criminalization hypothesis, is that because of this social factor, mentally ill people have been criminalized. Doesn't mean they're criminals, but they have been cast in a criminalized way. The second belief then is that people with mental illnesses are criminals, that they are dangerous and likely to commit crimes. And so which of these do you guys think is a more sociological approach? Right. So the first one, so deinstitutionalization is a course concept we worked with before. It's a social factor, and it's basically saying that changes in the social environment, changes in the society culture is what led to this outcome. The second one puts it more on the individual and says, people who are mentally ill are inherently violent and disruptive. And as I'll show you guys today, that's just not the case. So the criminal justice system in many ways is left to pick up the pieces after the failure of other institutions. And so keep in mind as we move forward, what types of social stressors contribute to this criminalization of the mentally ill? And then what failures of institutions have led to the incarceration of those with mental illnesses? So a truth that a lot of you probably came into this class thinking otherwise. So most people with mental illness are not violent, and only a small proportion of people with mental illnesses become violent. And so we'll talk about this a few times, but whenever you read the chapter from your textbook about Ellen Sachs, that was the one who had violent thoughts. She thought about killing babies. She had the really, really unhealthy relationship with her therapist. And I asked you guys, Ellen Sachs she had an advanced degree, very smart, very, very impressive resume. And, she went to Oxford, she had this great thesis. And so what I asked you guys is, well, how would you feel knowing that Ellen is your TA or your doctor? And almost everybody, and I appreciated your honesty, but almost everybody said that to some extent you would be uncomfortable with Ellen. And the reason why you'd be uncomfortable with Ellen Sachs is because you're concerned that she might become violent and you can't trust her. And so the reason I point this out right here with the slide is because a lot of us have the preconceived notion, the idea that mentally ill people are violent and will at some point become violent. Or at the very least, we think that all mentally ill people have the propensity for violence. However, as I'll demonstrate today, it's actually a very small proportion of people who are mentally ill who become violent. And most people with mental illnesses are not violent and never commit violent acts against others or against themselves. So what's going on then? If we're finding out here at this point, the mentally ill people are not committing violent crimes, why do we see this relationship? And that's what we'll talk about today. So remember, there are two overarching beliefs. One is that deinstitutionalization led to the criminalization of the mentally ill, and that the criminality argument is that mentally ill people are just more criminal. And so if we start with the first one, numerous mentally ill people are arrested and incarcerated who were previously in mental hospitals. And so what we have is police are largely entrusted with ensuring social order, including deciding how to take care of mentally ill people who are disrupting society or who are having, cops called on them to begin with. And so thinking about the fact that police officers are frequently who's called to the scene whenever somebody's having an episode, can you think of any harms that arise from this? Okay, so what we have really is a cycle. A mentally ill person is arrested, they're then released, they commit a minor infraction, trespassing, vagrancy, disorderly conduct, not being able to pay a fine, and then they're arrested again. And then they're released because they were only arrested on a misdemeanor, and then they commit that again, and vice versa, and it's really a cycle. We should keep in mind, though, that arrest data is not reflective of the actual crimes committed. And so the same crime done by somebody without a mental illness could very well go undetected. And so if we know that somebody is mentally ill, we might be more on guard for their behavior. If you have it in your mind that all of the people who live on the streets in New Brunswick are mentally ill, and then you see someone downtown talking to themselves, that might be more alarming than if you see somebody in your study group murmuring to herself before an exam. Whenever we know that somebody has a mental illness, we tend to look for actions that confirm that mental illness through their behaviors. And so the same crime done by somebody who is not known to have a mental illness might not solicit the attention from the police in the way that someone who is known to be mentally ill might. And so keep in mind as we move forward, especially through these next few slides, does police involvement lead to increased criminalization? And if so, how does that happen? So law enforcement did deal with the mentally ill even before deinstitutionalization. However, since deinstitutionalization, we do see more interaction. And so there has been an increase in police calls to control disruptive behavior. Overall, police do infrequently resort to formal dispositions. And so there's also the idea that police always, arrest people with mental illnesses, and that's actually not true. They typically only opt for arrest whenever they feel that they're going to be called back to, check on the same person multiple times. And so police tend to be more likely to resort to arrest if they feel that they're going to have to come back and address this more than one time. If they feel that this is something that can be taken care of at a one-off time, they're going to be less likely to put in the effort to arrest that person. They're more likely to opt for hospitalization whenever they perceive a lack of criminal intent. But remember what I talked to you guys about when it comes to labeling and deviance. The motives that we assign to a person are frequently born from their status characteristics. And so if we, I'll give you the example I've given you several times. So if we think about defiance disorders, if we think about oppositional defiance disorders, I've talked to you guys about if we have, a young white child and a young Black child, and they're doing the same exact behavior and they're getting on their teacher's nerves, the teacher's going to be a lot likely to, or a psychiatrist, I should say, would be a lot more likely to label the young Black child as having oppositional defiant disorder than the young white child, even if they're doing the same behavior. And remember that graph I showed you guys, that diagram, that visual, that your status characteristics, your race, your gender, your class, your sexuality, your ability is going to influence whether you're labeled as a deviant. Now, we all commit acts of deviance. We all do things that go against norms. However, only some people get labeled as deviants. And so to say that police only arrest people if they think they have criminal intent, well, there's truth to that. We have to also understand that who we assume to have criminal intent is also largely informed by the media and how we've been socialized, such that a police officer might think that a person of color is more likely to have criminal intent, even if they're behaving in the exact same way as a non-person of color. Also, the police may opt for hospitalization if they know the person has a mental illness, which again can be rooted to trusting that person or trusting people who know that person. So police will resort to arrest when treatment is preferable, when they feel they have no other options, when they feel that the behavior is going to proliferate and solicit future needed intervention, when suspects are non-compliant or hostile or fight with officers, when officers don't recognize that they have mental illness, maybe they think they're just being belligerent or hostile because they're not trained to know, police aren't trained in the DSM-5. They're not given a course on how to, cope with or cite or attend to people with mental illnesses. And so it's also possible that somebody who is having an episode, it might not even be recognized as such. Police are more likely to resort to arrest whenever the deviant behavior is public and exceeds the limits of tolerance. And that it's also worth noting that a lot of police also don't know this, that mental health practitioners can actually turn people away who have criminal charges or records. And so that's not something that a lot of police are actually even aware of. Of course, some are aware of it, but many are not, that people who have a criminal record actually can be turned away from getting mental health treatment from an actual center or practitioner. So who actually gets arrested then? And so prior to deinstitutionalization, patients released from mental health hospitals had lower rates of arrest than the general population. However, after deinstitutionalization, we find that arrest rates are much higher than the general population. So clearly something social is going on here. Much of the elevated arrests are due to the living conditions of the mentally ill. And so many people who are mentally ill do not have secure or stable housing and find themselves living on the streets. When you live on the streets, you are just more likely to live under conditions that are going to lead to arrest. You could do the same exact behavior as somebody who has a home and you'd be more likely to be arrested, largely because your acts are going to be much more public and you can't really hide them. So one thing we see is self-medication with alcohol and street drugs, which I've always said this and people think that I'm kidding sometimes, but we, judge people who are homeless for self-medicating, but like, honestly, kind of who wouldn't? That's a really rough way to live. And so if we think about the fact that people who are mentally ill, who are homeless or using substances, we'll also think about their social location and what they have to deal with. Again, there are social causes for this behavior. We see that abnormal behavior tends to be a lot more visible. And so if we think about, again, I've used this example many times because most of us have been to campus and are familiar. If you think about downtown New Brunswick, people who are living without housing, you think about the ones who are talking to themselves. Well, I could talk to myself, but I have a home. And so me talking to myself would largely go unnoticed. Versus if you do not have a house to live in, you're living on the streets, that same exact behavior of talking to yourself can elicit attention from people and then lead to the calling of police officers. And so part of why we see the relationship between the mentally ill, homeless population and arrest records is that a lot of the behavior that could go unnoticed, completely under the radar for people who have housing, it's just not able to be that way if you're living without a home because your behavior is just more visible. Arrest rates can also be misleading. And so we think about, rates might be higher of arrest because of revolving door patients. So it's not that, every single mentally ill person is getting arrested, but what we might see is that 1 or 2 or 3 or 10, 15, however many people are getting arrested over and over and over again. Those are the revolving door patients who can actually drive those arrest records up. So while it might seem, if you look at just statistics, that, there are a ton of arrests related to mental illness, what it actually might be is that there are a group of people who are being arrested over and over and over and over again. And then another social context is that upon release, the mentally ill are frequently not prepared for life outside of the institution, which then leads to that cycle of returning to communities that lack support. And I'll go back a few slides And we see this cycle here. So a person with mental illness is arrested, released, committing minor infractions. Now, look at the examples of the minor infractions that I gave you: trespassing, vagrancy, inability to pay fines. And so if you're arrested for trespassing because you are sleeping on the church steps because you don't have a home, and then you're fined for that and you can't pay your fines, you're going to end up right back in jail. And so without being prepared in jail, what's really going to make a difference for you that you don't repeat these same exact behaviors? You really get stuck in a cycle. And so prisons and jails do have higher rates of mental illness in the general population, which is again used to justify the criminality of the mentally ill. And so us talking about deinstitutionalization, that's the social context. However, remember, the other argument is that the mentally ill are just more criminal. And so if we only look at arrest data and we only look at incarceration, it's really easy to say, well, yeah, there is so much mental illness in the jail system because mentally ill people were just violent. But that's truly not the full story. Also, not all mental illnesses are represented in the same way. So we don't typically see a high proportion of depressive people in the jail, or even bipolar people, or even, which might be surprising, schizophrenic people. And so when we think about the people who are downtown talking to themselves, they typically have a schizoid type or a schizophrenic personality, a schizophrenic disorder. And those are the kind of people who you might imagine would be arrested. However, factually, they're actually not. We're more likely to see people who have substance abuse disorders and antisocial personality disorder in the jail systems. And so we have to also be careful whenever we make these general sweeping assumptions about mental illness, that because we see mental illness, therefore the mentally ill are violent. When even if we nuance that within the population, it's only certain disorders that we even see represented highly in the criminal justice system. So moving forward to the second one, the first one is the institutionalization. The second argument is that people who are mentally ill are just more criminal. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a video, because my argument is that the media is largely responsible for why we think this.
Capital went into lockdown yesterday after a woman tried to drive through a barricade outside the White House. The investigation now shows the woman was on medication for mental health problems, and relatives said she suffered from mental health issues.
Germanwings tragedy. Amid reports, the co-pilot who deliberately brought down that plane was suffering from depression.
Depression affects more than like 16 million people in this country.
Colleagues now telling us that Kevin Denny had been dealing with depression before yesterday's tragic shooting.
State report obtained by NBC News says mental health counselors found Cruz was depressed.
Adam Lanza murdered 20 first graders and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. The final prosecutor's report, out late today, says Lanza had significant mental health issues.
I kill people I like. Some of them beg for their life. I don't feel anything. It's a filthy world we live in.
Just don't point your fucking finger at crazy people.
It has nothing to do with them. I don't go where you say go, I go wrong. You don't put me away, Mr. Lewis. You don't put me away.
I'm not calming down. I don't give a fuck who you're not calming down. Anybody can wake up. I'm not saying
It's a medication problem.
Yeah,
He's fine.
He's fine now. You want to send him back to Baltimore?
You know all about the explosion at the psychiatrist's office.
Enough from the cloud.
Let's not blow. It's out of proportion.
What is the relationship between mental illness and violence?
I think what's important to know is that although the risk is increased, even taken as a whole, people with mental illness account for only a very small percentage of the violence in our society.
Only a very small percent of those who have a mental illness are violent toward other people.
The persons diagnosed with mental illness are actually far more likely to be the victims of violence.
1 in 4 adults actually suffer from some sort of mental illness. Count yourself, the person to the left, the person to the right of you, and the person behind or in front of you. That's 4. One of you is suffering from mental illness, but we're all high functioning adults. People don't know that.
Okay, so the way that we think about the mentally ill, the idea that, when I asked you guys, how would you feel if Ellen Sachs was your TA, your professor, your practitioner, your psychiatrist? A lot of you were uncomfortable, and your reason was because what if she does something violent? And the fact that we are so quick to associate violence with the mentally ill largely comes from the media. And so the truth is that the general public doesn't have a ton of personal experience of people with severe mental illness. Unless you have somebody who's close, like in your family, most people don't actually know anybody who suffer from this type of severe episodes. And so what happens then is whenever we do have the media linking mental illness to mass shootings, this exacerbates negative attitudes about the mentally ill. So if we think about the study by McGinty, Webster, and Berry done in 2013, this was an experimental study. And so the method was that they had two groups, the control group, which doesn't get the treatment. As you guys know, you've all taken methods classes, and the experimental group that gets the treatment. So they're randomly assigned, which, as you guys probably also know at this point, is the gold standard of experiments. And so the control group got no treatment, no exposure. They didn't watch or read anything. The experimental group then was randomly assigned to read news stories about a mass shooting. And the news story described the shooter as having a mental illness. So what did we find? Well, in McGinty, Webster, and Berry, we found that the experimental group had heightened negative attitudes towards the mentally ill, perceiving dangerousness and greater social distance from persons with mental illnesses. And so what does this mean? It means that we're really susceptible to what we're shown. And so just by being in an experiment, where you're in the experiment, so you know that they're going to try to gauge your reaction to something. You're already a bit aware, already on guard that people are looking for you to have some kind of reaction. And then to still have that reaction, even knowing that it's expected of you. So just by viewing a news story that says, this shooter had a mental illness, this terrorist had a mental illness, just by viewing that one news story, you're more likely to assume that all people with mental illnesses are capable of committing violent crime. And if we can see this increase in negative attitudes from one single experimental study that was entered into voluntarily, knowing it was an experiment, we'll think about all of the media that we consume day in and day out that we're not even nearly as critical about receiving. Luckily, there is hope. We are starting to see a movement towards more positive representation of mental illness. So I'm just going to show you a few examples. As always, I am going to have a link. So if you want to watch this whole thing, and I always encourage that you do, of course you can, but I'm going to just show you a few clips.
Occasionally, we're offered a glimmer of hope for perceptions of mental health in the media. Welcome to Ms. Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 most accurate depictions of mental illness in movies and TV. Before we begin, we publish new content every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. For this list, we're praising the films and shows that go out of their way to change the warped view of mental illness in media. Number 10, Tony Stark, Iron Man 3.
Remember I told you that I have an anxiety issue?
Does this subject make you edgy?
Yeah, a little bit. Can I just catch my breath for a second?
Are the bad guys in Roseville? Do you need a plastic bag to breathe into?
You know what's fantastic about Marvel? Their male characters aren't deemed any less manly for having emotions. When Stark has a near-death experience at the end of the Avengers, it damages his psyche.
What just happened?
Though the aliens are defeated, the battle in his mind is far from over. Whenever the wormhole is mentioned, his world seems to stop.
Wait, Tony.
He loses his breath and appears to dissociate. Jarvis officially identifies the debilitating episode as a panic attack.
My diagnosis is that you've experienced a severe anxiety attack.
Me?
Having a character experience this in such a popular movie matters. It shows kids and adults alike that even superheroes are affected by trauma. Number 9, Hannah Horvath, Girls.
5, 6, 7.
Junior, Silver Linings Playbook.
I'm undiagnosed bipolar. with mood swings and weird thinking brought on by severe stress.
Along with great acting and cinematography, this movie impressed with its realistic writing. In a world where a stay at a psychiatric hospital means stigma and alienation, Silver Linings Playbook brought a taboo topic to the forefront.
You ever take Klonopin?
Klonopin, yeah.
Right?
Jesus.
Like, is it what?
Yeah.
What day is it?
With mental illness, there's still love to be felt and relationships to be recovered and built. Throughout the film, Pat's bipolar disorder is portrayed accurately, from its milder symptoms to full-blown panic attacks. Similarly, love interest Tiffany suffers from depression and anxiety, exacerbated by the death of her husband. Together, they create a love story unlike any that had been told before.
Because I am so much crazier than you.
Keep your voice down.
I'm just a crazy slut with a dead husband. Forget it.
Number 6, Maria Bamford, Lady Dynamite.
So Larissa says that you think you're really funny and you have a lot.
BoJack Horseman, BoJack Horseman.
Idiot. What'd you do all day, piece of shit? That's a day you'll never get back. What was that?
We bet you'd never guess that a cartoon horse would make it on this list. However, any fan of this show knows exactly what we're talking about. BoJack had existing mental health issues worsened by child abuse and neglect. There's even an episode about what goes on in his head daily.
Oh, I don't deserve breakfast. Shut up. Don't feel sorry for yourself. What does that do? Get breakfast, you stupid badass. These are cookies. This is not breakfast.
Similar intrusive thoughts of self-deprecation, unearned guilt, and deep dread plague many with depression and anxiety alike. And his illness is anything but romanticized.
I have poison inside me and I destroy everything I touch. That's my legacy.
It's ugly, it hurts, and some days there's nothing he can do but go to bed and hope tomorrow will be better. We just hope he finds his real lasting happiness, despite his insisting that he doesn't deserve it.
That's not true. Yeah, it is. You stupid piece of shit. You're a real stupid piece of shit. And everywhere you go, you destroy people.
Number 3, Jessica Jones, Jessica Jones.
Do you want?
Okay, and so what we see that is not straightforward about these representations, and so, you know, the first video and the second video that I showed you, they both reference Silver Linings Playbook. And so on one end, we can see that the depiction of Patricio as violent and disruptive and chaotic portrays mentally ill people in the way that we're kind of used to seeing them, as unstable and unregulated. However, we also have, which is again a rough interpretation of the love interest, who is again a woman who was very emotional, who was irate, who was depressed over the loss of her lover. And this really feeds in the stereotypes, but also we do see a romance that we don't typically see among people who are mentally ill. And so whenever we praise media or we judge media, it typically doesn't, we should nuance it, because all of these representations have positive parts about them and negative parts about them as well. But what's most important is that we watch them with a critical eye. And so you can watch Silver Linings Playbook and it's okay to say, you know, this is a rough representation, or I feel really seen by this. But keeping in mind that by watching these things and seeing people with mental illnesses, we are extremely susceptible to how they are presented to us. So just make sure that you watch these episodes, these movies with a critical eye. So again, arrest data, criminality or criminalization. So if the criminality thesis is correct, the idea that, well, we see so much mental illness in prisons and jails because mentally ill people are just more violent. If the criminality thesis is correct, then what we would see then is arrest would be for violent behavior, but we don't see that. And so typically what people who are mentally ill get arrested for are the same exact things that Gen Pop gets arrested for: misdemeanors and small offenses rather than felonies. Very few arrests are actually for violent crimes. And so again, the argument that, well, we see so many criminals who are mentally ill because people who are mentally ill are criminals doesn't really hold up, because the crimes that the mentally ill are committing are the same exact crimes that people who are not mentally ill are committing. We don't see a proportionate of, you know, well, 70% of inmates are mentally ill and 70% of inmates, you know, have committed violent crimes. We typically see the mentally ill committing the same exact crimes that people who are not mentally ill are committing as well. And so the criminality perspective doesn't actually hold up if we think through it logically and think through the numbers that we have. In fact, people who are mentally ill are more likely to be victims of a violent crime than perpetrators. And so whenever we think about the relationship, if I were just to ask you, I mean, especially first day of the semester, what's the relationship between violence and the mentally ill? I would say a lot of you, especially if it were anonymous, would probably say mentally ill people can become violent. And while there's truth in that, what's truer would actually be the reverse, is that we're much more likely to see mentally ill people being victims of violence than committing violence. But again, if we think back to McGinty, Webster, and Berry, we're not shown that. We're shown images of the shooters being mentally ill, of terrorists being mentally ill. And so then we assume, because of what we're socialized to see from the media, people who are mentally ill commit these violent crimes, when in reality, they're more likely to actually be victims of these violent crimes. So criminal behavior doesn't always result in arrest. Many physical assaults and threats are not reported to the police or even seen by people. Only a small proportion of people with mental illness actually become violent. I've said that before. Hopefully you know this by now at this point in the lecture. And there are traits that are far more predictive of violence than severe mental illness. And so your marital status, your age, your gender, your socioeconomic status, your relationship with substances, where you live. So do you live in an organized, coherent, cohesive neighborhood? Do you live in a disorganized neighborhood where people don't trust each other? Your criminal history, all of these factors, again, including gender, like all of these factors are more predictive of whether you're going to commit a violent act than whether you have a severe mental illness. But again, we're not shown that in the media, so it might be harder to believe, but I tell you that it's true. And it also is backed up by your reading as well. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the not guilty by reason of insanity plea, which most of you just know as in the insanity plea. So to be found guilty of a crime and to be punished for a crime, you have to be blameworthy. What does that mean? To be blameworthy for a crime, you have to be able to choose rationally to commit the offense. And so if you're going to defend yourself against criminal charges, you have to understand the nature and purpose of the proceedings. And so a person can be mentally ill, severely with psychosis, but still meet the legal definitions of competence and sanity. So what happens with the NGRI plea then? Well, what we know is that the public doesn't like it. The public tends to dislike the insanity defense because of the perception that not guilty by reason of insanity is a common loophole in the law. So every single semester I teach this class, there's always several people. So if you're one of these people who in the last slide answered this way, don't feel bad, don't feel alienated, it happens every time. There are at least a few, sometimes a majority of people who talk about, without me even asking, how they worry about the insanity defense because they know of someone who knows of someone who got away from the death penalty because they pleaded insanity. We've all heard this story. However, the truth of the matter is that public concern is largely unfounded. And so the concern we have about the insanity plea is completely off from how it's used. So I'm going to give you some numbers and they're going to sound similar, but I want you to really think about what I'm saying here. So the insanity plea is used in less than 1% of all felony cases. Of that less than 1% of all felony cases where it's attempted, it's only effective in about 1% of those less than 1% of cases where it's brought up. So if we have less than 1% where it's attempted, and then 1% of that 1% where it's effective, well, then what happens to those people? Well, then only 1% of that 1% of that 1% are actually even released outright. Over 85% of people who are given the insanity defense, most of them, the overwhelming majority, are sent to a mental hospital. And so again, 1% tries it, 1% of that gets it, and then only 1% of that even gets out. Most people who use this defense and get an even higher sentence than if they had not even attempted it. And so courts are more likely to release convicted felons than they are to release people who were found to have effectively used the not guilty by reason of insanity defense. Among people who are released by the insanity plea, those who are charged with more serious crimes served longer periods of confinement in the mental hospital. And I know that you guys, because you're awesome, right? You read the reading for today, the 9th floor reading. And we've also read other readings that have talked about mental hospitals throughout the semester. And so you probably have a sense by now that mental hospitals don't necessarily always have much better conditions than prisons and jails. So think about what we talked about at the beginning of the semester. Deinstitutionalization. The push away from mental hospitals, the reason why psychiatrists even created the DSM, because remember, the DSM didn't really matter at first. It was only because people were attacking psychiatry as a field that psychiatrists then produced the DSM as a way to kind of protect against their profession, to legitimize their profession. And so one of the biggest insults or biggest complaints about the field of psychiatry is that the mental hospital, which is really the crux of the field, was inhumane. There are lobotomies, electric shock therapy, cockroaches are not being fed correctly. And so what I want you guys, the reason I bring this up is don't position, jail as this bad place and then mental hospitals as this saving grace that people weren't deserving of. They do bad things. In reality, a lot of mental hospitals have conditions that are comparable to these jails that you're thinking of. And so for people who are awarded the insanity plea, they're typically giving longer sentences at mental hospitals that might have even worse conditions than the jail they would have went to had they not tried to use that defense. Unsuccessful NGRI defendants, and so of that 1% of people who try this defense, the 99% who don't get it then have much higher detention times than felons who didn't even try it. And so even attempting, even if you truly in your heart of hearts, your lawyer or your attorney in their heart of hearts believe that you qualify for this defense, you're probably not going to get it. Doesn't matter whether you qualify or not. But if you don't get it, if you're one of the 99% to not get this, whether you qualify for it or not, you're actually going to have higher detention times than convicted felons who didn't raise the plea. And so just by raising the plea, you're basically accepting longer sentencing either in a jail or a mental hospital. You're not getting less sentencing unless you're the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. So what we've seen then is some states have enacted kind of a middle ground, a GBMI. So guilty but mentally ill is what GBMI stands for. And so because of the public concern, again, although now we all know is really genuinely unfounded, but because of this public concern, some states have adopted the guilty but mentally ill verdict in response to concerns about public leniency. And so by law, though, because again, it's a middle ground, defendants who are found to be guilty but mentally ill still must be punished. They don't get off. It's kind of like an asterisk in their file almost. And so what we see them is that because they still get punished, well, they get punished, but they also have the label of being mentally ill. That's my dog in the background. The stigma of being mentally ill. So people who do get the guilty but mentally ill verdict typically have higher rates of incarceration, longer sentencing times at time of sentencing, and then longer time spent serving their sentence versus people who got the not guilty by reason of insanity plea for the same offenses. And so guilty but mentally ill is really a response to the public concern, but the public concern is really unfounded. And the people who the public are worried about are actually not really benefiting from this system either. There are attempts to rectify it, but we're really trying to rectify a problem that's not really much of a problem at all. Again, thinking back to McGinty, Webster, and Berry, because we've all seen examples in TV shows and movies and docu-series of somebody who should have, went under the jail, but they got insanity plea and now they're back out terrorizing people again. We've all seen that media, but in reality, that's just not how it happens. And so we have things like the GBMI verdict in response to the public concern, which is largely unfounded anyways. So in summary, most people with severe mental illnesses fall into one of 5 groups. And so the criminal justice system does interact with a large number of people who are mentally ill, but it's typically people who fall into one of 5 of these groups. Offenders arrested for nuisance behavior. So disturbing the peace, sleeping on church steps, people arrested for survival behaviors. And so such as shoplifting, or even failure to pay for restaurant meals or paying fines. People who are addicted to drugs and the criminal behavior that results from addiction. People who are psychopathic or fit the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. And then people who fit the stereotypical image of the madman out of control, which again, this is what we're shown. If I were to, without having taught you all of this juicy info all semester, first day of the semester said, what's a schizophrenic person look like? Or what does an insane person look like? You guys would conjure up images that you've seen from the media. And so what we see here is, despite the fact that most people who are mentally ill in prisons have just stolen food because they were hungry, or they trespassed and needed somewhere to sleep, or they couldn't pay a fine, or they were talking to themselves and couldn't hide it behind their, comfy loft. Those are people who are getting arrested. However, the very small group, number 5 here, the madman out of control, this very small group is the one that receives the most media attention. And so even though this is the smallest group of arrestees, we generalize this to the entire population because, again, that's what we've been socialized to believe. However, it's incorrect and misleading to generalize from this behavior to the other groups. So to say that somebody who is, publicly nude is just as criminal as somebody who is a quote unquote madman, that's not fair. To link together people who are using drugs with people who are sleeping on church steps, it's different behavior. And so we have to be careful about generalizing behavior of one of these to the other groups. It's also misleading and completely incorrect to generalize from these groups onto all people with mental illnesses, because these groups of people do not represent all people with mental illnesses. And so most members of all of these 5 groups, nuisance behavior, survival mechanisms, substance dependence, ASPD, the quote unquote madman, what they have in common is that they tend to inhabit impoverished communities, which makes it more difficult to survive outside of institutions. And so if you are somebody who is arrested because you're stealing food, there are people who will steal food or steal things to get into jail because that's the only way that they can get a roof over their heads and that they can be fed food. And so a lot of these groups, what we find in common is an unstable social environment. And so high prevalence of drugs, alcohol, crime, and violence in their environment is typically what leaves them in these vulnerable positions. Okay, so I'm gonna stop right there. I'll be right back to talk to you about your Voices textbook, assignment number 505, and your Voices presentation.